Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight I want to take you into a story of survival, of grit, and of hope, set in one of the hardest years people in medieval Europe ever faced. The year 1315. Historians call it the coldest year, a season when endless rains destroyed crops, when frost turned fertile ground into stone, and when hunger walked from cottage to cottage like an unwelcome guest. We're going to step inside the life of one family, an ordinary household who lived through extraordinary hardship, and see how they endured when everything, the weather, the land, even sickness itself seemed to rise up against them. And if you enjoy these journeys into the past, where history feels close enough to touch, please do me a favor. Hit that like button and follow along, because every bit of support keeps stories like this alive. It began in summer, and instead of golden fields and heavy harvests, the skies opened up. Day after day, gray clouds pressed low, rain slamming down so hard it drowned the earth. Fields that should have been filled with tall barley and wheat became oceans of mud. Farmers trudged out, hands sinking into the muck, watching seedlings wither before their eyes. Grain sprouted in storage barns because there was no way to keep it dry. Cattle slipped in marshy fields and caught disease, and nothing felt secure anymore. People had lived through dry years, cold years, even plagues of insects before, but this was different. It wasn't a single bad season. It was a world turned against them. Our family, will call them the Bruns, stood in disbelief. The father had known these fields all his life. He could tell by the smell of soil when rain was coming. He could read the tilt of the wind for signs of frost. But nothing in his memory prepared him for skies that refused to clear. His wife, Anna, tried to reassure the children, telling them that rains always ended, that God would not leave them in despair. Yet each morning when they opened the cottage door, the ground sagged heavier, and each evening when they tried to dry their clothes by the fire, the rain still battered the roof. By autumn, hope had rotted along with the crops. Barns that should have been stuffed with sheaves of grain stood nearly empty. Where families once piled sacks high against the winter, there was only a scattering of onions, a basket of peas, a few wedges of cheese salted and hidden away, and a single smoked pig. The Bruns looked at their little stockpile and knew the truth. It would not last. Not through a winter in the north, not through a winter like the one that was coming. When November winds swept across the valley, the Bruns gathered their children close. 2 boys, one on the cusp of manhood, the other still a lively dreamer, and a daughter, the youngest, small enough to believe that her father's arms could shield her from anything. The mother rationed carefully. Bread grew thinner, soups stretched with water, meat cut into pieces so small they seemed almost symbolic. Hunger set in, not the kind that makes you complain you missed lunch, but the slow gnawing that never lets go. It made laughter scarce, drained energy, and turned every meal into a reminder of what was slipping away. Villagers turned to the church for comfort. The stone walls echoed with desperate prayers, candles flickering against cold gray pillars. Priests spoke of sin, punishment, and mercy. People wept openly, begged for forgiveness, offered penance. The Bruns knelt among their neighbors, heads bowed, hands clasped tight. For a few moments, the chanting voices made them feel less alone. But when they stepped back outside, rain still poured, clouds still pressed heavy, and hunger still waited at their door. Faith gave courage, yes, but not food. And then came the morning that changed everything. Rain finally ceased, leaving the world strangely silent. The eldest boy pushed open the cottage door, and the world outside shimmered white frost. It glittered across every branch and blade, beautiful in the dawn light, cruel in its message. Whatever crops had survived, the rains were now frozen stiff. The father walked the field in silence, touched the soil hardened like stone, and bowed his head. He had hoped for one last harvest, one final chance at barley or rye, but hope turned brittle under that frost. That night, he spoke plainly by the weak crackle of the hearth. "We must eat less," he told his children. "Stretch what we have. Make it last." His voice was firm, but not angry. It was the sound of a man accepting the weight of winter. Even the youngest understood enough to nod. That day, Anna baked bread thinner than ever before. She mixed what little barley flour remained with acorns, boiling away the bitterness until it was just barely edible. The loaves came out heavy, dense, more like stones than bread, but when she broke them and placed the pieces into her children's hands, she did so as though handing them treasure. The fire became their lifeline, but wood was scarce. The eldest son trudged into the forest each day, returning with sticks so small they barely kept the flames alive. Other families stripped the woods as well. Smoke from damp logs filled the cottage, stinging eyes, clinging to their hair, but still they kept it burning, because without fire, cold would seep into their very bones. At night, the children huddled together beneath blankets, breath visible in the air, listening to the whistle of the wind through cracks in the walls. Sometimes they looked out the small window and saw stars burning sharp and bright. "They look like tiny fires," the youngest whispered. "Maybe they can keep us warm from far away." Her father placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then hold on to that thought," he said. "Because in times like this, we must hold on to every light we can." The marketplace no longer bustled with laughter and barter. Instead, it was heavy with silence. A shriveled turnip here, a handful of onions there, sold at prices no poor family could pay. Bread became as precious as gold. Meat was almost gone. Families slaughtered chickens and pigs long ago, their smokehouses now cold. The eldest Brune boy once stood in the square as a cart rolled past, filled with sacks of grain guarded by men in the Lord's colors. His fists clenched at the sight. The food was so close, yet impossibly out of reach. He thought of his sister's thin face, of his mother's hollowed cheeks, but he also knew what theft meant. Swift punishment, sometimes death. He lowered his gaze and walked away, anger simmering like a hidden coal. Still, the Bruns refused to surrender. They worked together. The father stacked wood carefully near the hearth. The mother dried nettles and herbs to stretch their soups. The children tied kindling into bundles with stiff, frozen fingers. At night, when the fire burned low, the father spoke softly, his voice calm in the darkness. "We cannot know how long the cold will last, but as long as we are together, we will endure. Every stick, every crumb, every moment we must guard them as though they are life itself." The flames flickered across their faces, hunger carving shadows under their eyes, but determination glowed there too. They knew the frost would deepen, that sickness whispered through neighboring cottages, that wolves prowled closer to the edges of the forest. Yet through it all, they clung to each other. Because survival in 1315 was never just about fire or food, it was about family. When December deepened, the Brune family learned that hunger had a way of changing everything. It wasn't just the emptiness in their stomachs. It was the way their minds slowed, how their bodies moved with effort, how laughter disappeared like a memory. The children no longer asked for more bread because they understood there was no more to give. The youngest, who once danced and hummed as she worked beside her mother, now sat quietly by the sand fire, eyes large, voice small. And Anna, her hands cracked from cold and labor, still found the strength to brush her daughter's hair back and whisper, "You are strong, little one, stronger than winter." The father carried the heaviest burden. Each day he walked the muddy paths to check on neighbors, partly for news, partly for a chance to trade. Sometimes he returned with nothing but rumors that in the next village over, whole families had collapsed from starvation, that thieves had been caught stealing barley from the Lord's granary, that the rains, unbelievably, still fell in distant valleys. Other times he returned with small mercies, a bundle of firewood from a kind neighbor, a scrap of salted fish offered in exchange for herbs, or a promise that when spring returned, they would help each other till the soil again. These gifts mattered, not because they filled their stomachs, but because they reminded the Bruns that they were not alone. The eldest boy watched all of this closely. Hunger was shaping him, chiseling away the softness of youth, leaving something leaner, sharper, older. He no longer saw himself as a child. He rose before dawn, helped his father check the animals, gathered sticks from the forest's edge, and even learned how to patch holes in the roof with frozen mud. Each task was more than work. It was survival. And yet, even in his seriousness, he caught himself looking at the stars at night, whispering small prayers, wondering what kind of world would be waiting if they lived to see spring. By Christmas, the village was a shadow of its former self. Where once bells rang with joy and feasting filled long tables, this year only the faint toll carried across the valley, muted by snow and hunger. Families gathered in church, not with gifts and laughter, but with tears and pleas. The Brune family walked the frozen path together, their boots crunching in the snow, their breaths puffing out like smoke. Inside the church, candles flickered, and the smell of wax mixed with the musty scent of damp wool and unwashed bodies. The priest spoke of endurance, of faith tested like gold in fire, of the promise that suffering would pass. The father bowed his head, gripping his son's shoulder. The mother wept silently, clutching the youngest to her chest. For one moment, surrounded by neighbors who all bore the same hollowed eyes and thin faces, the Bruns felt both despair and belonging. Everyone was suffering, but everyone was holding on. The weeks dragged forward. By January, wolves came closer. Hunger drove them out of the forests, their eyes flashing yellow in the darkness. At night, the family heard them, low howls threading through the frozen air. The goats bleated nervously, pressed against the walls of the pen. The father and eldest boy took turns keeping watch, a crude spear in hand. The fire kept alive more for fear than warmth. One night, a wolf padded close, its shape barely visible in the moonlight. The eldest boy's heart hammered, his hands gripping the spear so tight his knuckles whitened. His father raised a hand. "Steady," he whispered. The wolf paused, sniffed, and then melted back into the woods. Danger retreated, but the memory of its eyes lingered. Inside the cottage, Anna turned meals into rituals of comfort. She boiled thin soups with dried nettles, stretched flour with ground acorns, and seasoned barley with whatever herbs she had managed to dry in summer. It wasn't enough to fill them, but it kept them alive. More importantly, she insisted they eat together, even if the portions were tiny. She taught her children to chew slowly, to savor each bite, to see food not just as survival, but as hope. Every spoonful is proof we are still here, she reminded them. The youngest daughter, despite her small frame, carried a spark of resilience that amazed them all. She collected frost-covered twigs, hummed to herself as she swept the floor, and found ways to laugh, even when her stomach growled. Once, when the family sat shivering, she pointed to the frost patterns on the window and said, "Look, the world has painted flowers for us." The family turned to the icy glass and, for the first time in days, smiled. Even in hunger, beauty had a way of creeping in. As February arrived, illness swept the village. Malnutrition made everyone fragile, and colds turned into fevers that claimed lives. The Brunn family fought it as best they could. Anna brewed teas from dried chamomile and mint, pressed warm cloths against her children's foreheads, and whispered prayers through the night. The father's face was etched with worry, but he never showed fear in front of his children. When the middle boy's cough grew deep and rattling, the eldest gave up his portion of bread, so his brother could eat more. It wasn't just sacrifice, it was love, the kind that doesn't ask or expect, the kind that simply gives because life depends on it. And then, slowly, as March drew near, the air shifted. Snow softened, melting into rivulets that ran through the fields. The sun lingered just a little longer in the sky each day, its warmth faint but undeniable. Birds returned, their songs thin but bright, against the silence of winter. For the Brunns, it felt like a whisper of mercy. The father stood at the edge of the thawing fields, mud clinging to his boots, and let the pale sunlight fall across his face. "It is not the end," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "The land still remembers how to live." Inside, Anna prepared the last of their stored herbs, mixing them into porridge made from the final handful of barley. The children ate eagerly, the warmth spreading through their hollowed bodies. For the first time in months, laughter returned, faint and fragile but real. The youngest clapped her hands at the sight of a small green shoot pressing up through the mud outside the cottage. Life was returning, cautiously, tentatively, but it was returning. The Brunn family had endured the hardest stretch of their lives, a season when everything seemed designed to break them. And yet, they still stood. Thin, yes. Weary, yes. But alive, together, and ready to face the thaw. For in 1315, surviving the coldest year was not about strength alone. It was about patience, love, and the stubborn refusal to let winter steal the light from their hearts. Spring in 1316 did not arrive like a festival, with trumpets and banners. It came quietly, hesitantly, like a weary traveler testing the ground after a long, brutal road. For the Brunn family, every sign mattered. A drop of water trickling through thawed soil, a robin pecking at the ground, a thin blade of green pushing upward where the snow had retreated. After months of gray, even the smallest hint of life felt like a miracle. The father rose early each morning, stepping into the mud that clung to his boots and smelled of thawing earth. He scanned the fields with practiced eyes. He knew the soil was exhausted from the relentless rains of the previous year, but he also knew it was all they had. His eldest son followed, carrying a small basket of seeds saved from last summer. Each seed was precious, a tiny promise they could not afford to waste. The boy pressed them gently into the damp soil, as though tucking children into bed. The middle child crouched close by, his fingers digging shallow trenches for peas. He looked up often, searching for his father's nod of approval. Each nod was more than permission, it was trust, the kind that lifted his young shoulders higher. The youngest daughter toddled around, dropping twigs into neat rows as markers. She laughed when mud splashed on her face, her joy echoing across the fields. In her laughter, the whole family heard the sound of hope returning. Inside the cottage, Anna worked with equal devotion. She turned the last shriveled roots into broth, flavored with the first herbs the children had gathered. The scent was sharp, earthy, alive, so different from the bland, thin soups of deep winter. As her family slurped eagerly, she smiled through her own hunger, reminding them, this is the taste of beginning again. By mid-March, the village stirred with the same cautious optimism. Neighbors leaned on one another more openly now, trading seeds, lending tools, and exchanging advice. One family showed the Bruns how to weave straw mats to protect young shoots from frost. In return, Anna shared bundles of dried mint that could ease coughs. These small acts built bridges that the harshest winter had nearly broken. Still, life was fragile. Storms swept through with little warning, flattening tender shoots. Some days, the fields looked hopeless again, beaten down by wind and cold rain. On those days, the father reminded his children, the land falls and rises just as we do. What matters is that we stand up again with it. And so, they replanted, patched, tried again. Survival had taught them persistence, the quiet kind that doesn't boast but endures. By April, green returned in earnest. Meadows dotted with wildflowers shimmered against the pale sky. Streams, once frozen, now danced with clear water. Children in the village, once too weak to play, began chasing each other again. The Brune children collected dandelions and herbs, their baskets filling with color and fragrance. Anna boiled these into stews that carried a brightness their bodies had almost forgotten. Each spoonful tasted not just of food, but of renewal. The eldest boy, growing taller and leaner, had begun to see himself as his father's partner. He carried tools with steady hands, copied the way his father studied soil, and even corrected his younger siblings with gentle authority. Hunger had aged him, but spring was teaching him responsibility. The middle child found satisfaction in smaller tasks, pulling weeds, guiding water with little trenches, tying shoots with bits of straw. Each small success lit his face with pride. And the youngest, still too little for heavy work, brought light simply by being herself. She sang as she scattered seeds, her voice high and sweet, carrying across the fields like a promise that joy, too, could survive famine. Evenings in the cottage grew warmer, not only from the hearth, but from the spirit of the family. They gathered around meals of herbs, greens, and bits of dried grain, sharing stories of the day. The father spoke of the importance of foresight, the mother of patience, and the children of the tiny miracles they had seen, a bee buzzing, a blossom opening, a bird returning. These weren't just observations. They were lessons in resilience, in recognizing that life's smallest gifts could mean everything when the world seemed against you. By May, The fields around the cottage shimmered with promise. Rows of barley pushed upward, peas twined along supports, and vegetables took root with surprising vigor. The father taught his children to study the plants closely, to notice how leaves turned toward the sun, how soil held or lost water, how pests could creep in silently. "The land speaks," he told them. "We must learn to listen." The children listened, not only with their ears but with their hands, their eyes, their hearts. And in those long spring days, the Brunn family discovered something deeper than survival. They learned to live again, not with abundance, but with gratitude. Every shoot, every green leaf, every clear stream was celebrated. Hunger had hollowed them, but spring filled them with a strength that no winter could take away. By early summer, they would have more. But for now, in the fragile bloom of 1316, survival was no longer just endurance. It was renewal, patience, and the quiet joy of knowing that even after the coldest year, life could begin again. Summer did not sweep in with ease. It arrived slowly, one long day at a time, stretching the sun higher into the sky and drying the damp earth that had nearly drowned their hopes in the spring. For the Brunn family, those early summer weeks were a balance of relief and caution. The green shoots had taken root, but everyone knew how quickly fortune could turn. By June, the barley stood knee-high, trembling in the warm breeze like a green ocean. The eldest boy walked between the rows with a stick in hand, brushing it gently along the stalks. He mimicked his father's careful steps, checking for signs of pests or disease. Each time he spotted a healthy stalk, he straightened with pride, as though he himself had coaxed it from the soil. The middle child took joy in tending the peas. He carefully tied them to sticks, guiding their climb toward the Sunday. Sometimes he whispered to them nonsense words and little encouragements, as if his voice could help them grow stronger. His mother laughed softly at his efforts, but never discouraged him. After all, every bit of attention mattered. When a family's survival depended on fragile plants, the youngest daughter continued to be the light of their days. Too small for heavy work, she carried pebbles to mark rows, splashed water from a clay jug, and sang while her family toiled. Her laughter scattered across the fields like birdsong. In her joy, the family found a reminder of why they worked so hard, not just to survive, but to keep joy alive. Inside the cottage, Anna transformed the first small harvests into meals that seemed almost luxurious after months of gruel. Fresh peas simmered with herbs, barley porridge sweetened with wild berries, a stew rich with greens and roots. The flavors were bright, fresh, alive flavors they had nearly forgotten existed. Even the smallest meal felt like a feast. Around the hearth, the family ate slowly, savoring each bite with reverence. The father, though grateful, never let his guard down. He had seen too many neighbors lose everything to a sudden storm or a swarm of pests. He taught his children vigilance. "The land is generous, yes," he said one evening, as they watched the fields glow gold under the setting Sunday. "But it is also quick to test us. We must be ready for both gift and challenge." The village hummed with the same energy. Neighbors moved between fields, sharing tools, trading seeds, and offering advice. After the famine winter, no one could afford pride. Survival had taught them humility. One evening, the Brunns welcomed a neighbor carrying a basket of onions. In return, Anna offered fresh peas and herbs. They ate together by the fire, their voices soft but steady, weaving threads of community that had frayed in the harshest months. By July, the air was heavy with warmth and the scent of blooming flowers. Streams ran clear, reflecting the wide blue sky. Children from the village, once too thin and weak to play, now chased one another through the meadows. Laughter returned to the land, tentative at first, then bolder, as if joy had remembered its way home. Yet not every day was easy. Some afternoons, storms rolled across the sky without warning, pelting the fields with rain and threatening the fragile crops. The father and eldest boy scrambled to tie down stalks and dig trenches to divert water. The middle child rushed to gather herbs before they drowned, while the youngest clapped at the thunder, not yet old enough to fear it. Inside, Anna lit the hearth early, her stew simmering as the family dried by the fire. "Storms pass," she said calmly, "but our work remains." When the storms cleared, the family stepped outside to inspect the damage. Bent stalks were straightened, waterlogged soil drained, and tender shoots replanted. Each setback became a lesson. The children learned that resilience was not about avoiding hardship, but about meeting it head-on with patience and steady hands. By midsummer, their resilience paid off. The garden burst with life. Barley swayed tall and strong, peas climbed high, and vegetables filled the soil with color and promise. The family harvested their first true bounty baskets of peas, herbs, and early barley. Anna baked the first loaves of fresh bread they had tasted in nearly a year. When the family sat around the hearth and tore into the warm loaves, the smell alone brought tears to her eyes. Bread, so simple, felt like proof that they had survived the impossible. That night, as the fire crackled and the family ate together, the father looked around at his wife and children. His voice was low, steady. "This," he said, holding up a piece of bread, "is more than food. It is proof that the coldest year did not defeat us. It is proof that when we stand together, we endure." The children listened silently, their faces glowing in the firelight. Outside, the summer wind whispered through the fields, carrying with it the steady rhythm of survival, resilience, and renewal. As July bled into August, the rhythm of life settled into something that felt almost normal. The Brun family woke with the sun, worked in the fields until their muscles ached, and ended each evening by the hearth with simple meals that finally filled their bellies. Yet beneath the warmth of summer was a quiet awareness. Winter would come again, and this time they vowed to be ready. The barley fields shimmered under the sun, each stalk swaying like a golden promise. The eldest boy, now taller and stronger from months of work, learned how to test the grain. His father showed him to rub the seeds between his fingers, to feel for dryness, to judge if it was ready for cutting. Each handful of grain was more than food. It was survival, measured in kernels. The middle child took pride in collecting herbs, bundling them neatly to dry in the cottage rafters. The fragrant smell of sage, thyme, and mint filled the home, mingling with the smoke of the hearth. Anna reminded her children that these herbs would flavor their food in the dark months ahead, keeping illness at bay and spirits strong. The youngest daughter, though small, contributed in her own way. She carried baskets, scattered straw to protect tender plants, and filled the cottage with her bright voice. Sometimes she picked wildflowers and tucked them into the cracks of the wooden beams, bringing color to the dim corners of their home. Her presence reminded everyone that life was not only about survival, but about finding small joys along the way. By August, the first real harvest began. The father and eldest boy cut barley carefully, stacking the stalks in tall bundles to dry beneath the sunday. It was heavy, exhausting work. Sweat soaked their tunics, and their hands blistered from the sickles. But their hearts swelled with pride as the field slowly emptied into orderly rows of grain. Each bundle was proof that their struggle had meaning, that hunger would not rule them this winter. Anna worked tirelessly in the cottage, grinding some of the barley into flour, baking loaves that filled the air with the smell of warmth itself. She taught her children to eat slowly, to appreciate each bite, reminding them of the bleak months when they had nothing but thin gruel. Now, bread returned to their table, a luxury that felt like a miracle. The village moved with the same urgency. Neighbors traded advice on storing grain, swapped surplus vegetables, and lent tools to one another. Bonds that had frayed in the famine winter were mended through shared labor. Children played in the fields after work, their laughter echoing across the valley, a sound that had been absent for too long. But with the harvest came storms. Heavy rains rolled across the land, threatening to undo months of care. One afternoon, thunder cracked over the hills and rain lashed the cottage roof. The Brune family rushed into the fields, tying down barley, covering vegetables with straw, and digging channels to guide the water away. The children worked shoulder to shoulder with their parents, mud clinging to their legs, hair plastered with rain. When the storm finally passed, the family returned soaked and weary, but their crops stood mostly intact. Inside, Anna dried the children's clothes by the fire and served hot stew thickened with barley. The father's voice, steady but firm, carried across the room. Storms will come, as they always do, but storms pass. What matters is that we stand firm, that we protect what we've built. By late August, the fields rippled gold under the fading summer Sunday. The harvest continued, slow and steady, each day adding to their store of grain, herbs, and vegetables. The family's hands were calloused, their backs sore, but their hearts were full. The memory of famine had not vanished, but it no longer defined them. One evening, after a long day's work, the family sat outside their cottage. The fields stretched before them, dotted with golden bundles of barley, the air warm and sweet. Anna placed her arm around her youngest daughter, while the eldest boy leaned against his father, tired but proud. The middle child hummed softly, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. The father broke the silence. "Do you see this?" he asked, gesturing toward the fields. "This is what it means to endure. We were tested by the coldest year, and we did not fall. This land gives back because we cared for it. Remember that. Remember that strength lies not only in surviving, but in preparing, in protecting, and in standing together." The children nodded, their faces glowing in the amber light of dusk. Above them, the first stars appeared, steady and eternal, and beneath them, the land whispered with life, ready to carry them into the next season. As September crept in, the air shifted. The sun still shone warmly at midday, but the mornings carried a crisp bite, and evenings arrived sooner than the family would have liked. The Brune family, though, did not fear the shortening days. This time, they were ready. The fields around their cottage stood tall and golden, barley swaying like a sea under the cool breeze. Every Stalk represented survival, every grain a shield against hunger. The father led his eldest son through the rows, teaching him to cut carefully, to bundle stalks tightly, and to stack them where air and sun could dry them. It wasn't just farming, it was a ritual of resilience, a lesson etched into every swing of the sickle. The middle child worked beside Anna, gathering herbs, vegetables, and roots. Together they laid them out on woven mats near the hearth, letting smoke and warmth dry them for storage. The smell of thyme, sage, and onions drifted through the cottage, clinging to their clothes and settling in the wood. To Anna, that scent was more than food, it was safety, a promise that when snow came again, her children would not cry from empty bellies. The youngest daughter, still too small for heavy work, took pride in small tasks. She carried baskets of herbs, stacked firewood, and placed straw under the stored bundles of barley. Her laughter echoed as she darted between her brothers, her joy a reminder that life was more than toil. The family needed her lightness as much as they needed the food. By mid-September, the harvest reached its peak. Neighbors moved through fields together, calling out greetings as they cut and bundled. The village hummed with energy, a shared rhythm of hands working, blades slicing, baskets filling. After months of famine and silence, the sound of labor was almost like music, a chorus of survival. Yet autumn carried its own warnings. Dark clouds rolled in, and wind swept across the valley. One afternoon, a sudden storm rattled shutters and bent the barley stalks. The Bruns rushed into action. The father and eldest boy tied down vulnerable rows, while Anna and the children pulled baskets of vegetables inside before the rain ruined them. By the time the skies cleared, the family was soaked, their hair plastered to their foreheads, but the crops were safe. That night, as steam rose from bowls of barley stew, the father looked around the table and spoke softly. Storms test us, just as winters do, but storms pass. What matters is how we prepare and how we endure. His words sank deep, carried by the flicker of the hearth and the steady rhythm of spoons scraping bowls. As the days shortened, the family worked faster. They built racks to dry vegetables, wove ropes of onions and garlic to hang from the beams, and tucked sacks of barley into dry corners of the cottage. Anna taught her children the art of stretching food, how to season stews with herbs, how to grind roots into flour, how to save every crumb of bread. She knew these lessons would outlast her, carried into generations yet to come. The evenings became quieter, more reflective. After the day's work, the family sat by the fire, the children recounting discoveries from the fields. A bird's nest tucked in the hedges, a fox darting across the meadow, mushrooms hidden beneath damp leaves. Their voices were soft, but their eyes shone with curiosity and wonder. Outside, the village prepared in much the same way. Smoke curled steadily from chimneys, neighbors traded preserves, and children helped carry baskets of grain to shared storage huts. The air buzzed with cautious optimism. Winter was coming, yes, but unlike the year before, they would not meet it unprepared. One night in late September, the family sat together by the hearth. The barley hung in neat bundles above them, herbs dried in fragrant ropes, vegetables stored carefully in baskets. The cottage, once a fragile shelter against frost, now felt like a fortress of warmth and foresight. The father placed a hand on the eldest boy's shoulder. "This is what survival looks like," he said. Not just enduring, but learning. Not just waiting, but working. Remember this when the nights grow long again. The boy nodded, understanding that these words were more than instructions. They were a legacy, a passing down of knowledge that would one day rest entirely on its shoulders. Outside, autumn winds rattled the trees, scattering leaves across the fields. But inside, the Brun family sat steady and strong, surrounded by the fruits of their labor. The coldest year had taught them hard lessons. Now, as autumn deepened, they carried those lessons like armor, ready to face whatever came next. By mid-October, the valley had changed its colors. The fields that once shimmered with gold now lay bare, the barley already cut and stored. Trees along the edges of the forest burned in shades of red, orange, and brown, their leaves tumbling into the chilly wind and carpeting the earth in a brittle blanket. For the Brun family, this beauty was also a warning. Winter was only weeks away. The father rose early each morning to check the stored crops. He showed the eldest boy how to lift the sacks, feel for dampness, and spread the grain if moisture threatened to spoil it. One bad bundle, he said, can ruin the rest. Pay attention to the small things. The boy nodded, understanding that vigilance was now as vital as labor. Anna worked in the cottage, stringing ropes of dried vegetables and herbs, hanging them from beams and hooks until the ceiling itself seemed to bloom with food. The smell of thyme, garlic, and onions filled the air, mixing with smoke from the hearth. To visitors, it might have seemed humble, but to her, those ropes of food were garlands of survival. The middle child spent hours outside, gathering firewood. His hands, still small but hardened by work, clutched branches and twigs that he stacked carefully under the cottage eaves to keep them dry. He took pride in the pile growing taller each day, a visible measure of his contribution to the family's safety. The youngest helped in her own way, sweeping the cottage floor, sorting small stones from baskets of roots, and singing softly as she worked. Her laughter broke the silence of the colder evenings, warming the family in ways fire alone never could. By late October, the color minders of the Carl Bong. Winds grew sharper, rattling the shutters at night and sending leaves swirling in restless circles across the fields. One evening, a storm rolled in suddenly. Rain lashed against the roof, and the wind howled through the cracks in the thatch. The father climbed onto the roof in the dim light, securing loose bundles of straw, while the eldest boy held the ladder steady. Inside, Anna kept the fire burning high while gathering the younger children close, her heart pounding with both fear and determination. When the storm finally passed, the family stepped outside into a landscape washed clean by rain. The barley stacks glistened, and the air smelled of wet earth and fallen leaves. Though weary, they were grateful the roof had held, the food was safe, and the storm had tested their strength without breaking it. That night, as bowls of hot barley porridge steamed on the table, the father spoke softly. Storms remind us we are never in full control, but we can prepare, we can act, and we can endure. That is enough. His words lingered, carried by the glow of the fire and the quiet crackle of wood. The village mirrored their efforts. Neighbors worked side by side, sharing tools, trading portions of food, and reinforcing cottages with straw and clay. Children carried small baskets of herbs and vegetables from one home to another, and the square filled with the soft murmur of advice and gratitude. It was no longer just about survival, it was about community, about realizing that hardship shared was hardship lessened. As October faded, the Brune family settled into a rhythm of labor and reflection. Days were shorter, meals heartier, and the hearth became the unquestioned center of their lives. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they sat close together, telling stories, carving small wooden figures, and whispering prayers of thanks for the harvest that now surrounded them. The father often reminded his children, "Every grain, every log, every stitch of cloth is a victory over the winter ahead. Do not take any of it for granted." The eldest boy repeated those words under his breath, almost like a vow, as he practiced tying rope or inspecting grain. Outside, the first frosts began to appear, silvering the fields and glazing the edges of the forest. The family would wake to see the world sparkling white under the pale dawn light, beautiful yet cold. The youngest squealed with delight at the frost's crunch beneath her boots, but Anna pulled her close, whispering, "Enjoy it, but remember, it is a warning." By early November, preparations deepened. The father taught his sons to sharpen tools and repair fences, while Anna showed her daughter how to mend cloth with careful, patient stitches. Even the goats, once thin from the famine year, grew stronger on what little grass remained. Their milk, though modest, added richness to the family's meals. At night, as frost pressed against the windows and the fire glowed steadily, the Brune family drew strength from one another. They knew the bitterest months still lay ahead, but they also knew they were not the same family that had faced the famine unprepared. This time, they had foresight. This time, they had a plan. And above all, this time, they had hope. By mid-November, the days had grown shorter still. Dawn came late, its pale light barely brushing the fields before fading again into the long arms of dusk. The Brune family adjusted to the rhythm, rising with the dim glow and finishing their outdoor tasks quickly before the sun vanished. The chill was sharper now, but it was no longer the biting hunger of the famine year. This time, they faced it with food in their stores, wood at the ready, and lessons etched deeply into their memory. The father worked with the eldest boy each morning, checking the bundles of barley stacked neatly in the barn. He showed him how to shift the sacks so air could circulate, preventing mold, and how to watch for signs of pests. "One careless glance," he warned, "and months of labor can vanish overnight." The boy nodded, his hands steady, his eyes sharp. He was no longer a child waiting for food, he was learning to guard the family's survival. Anna, meanwhile, turned the cottage into a fortress of warmth and order. She arranged baskets of vegetables in cool corners, hung dried herbs in neat clusters above the hearth, and layered straw against the walls to keep the wind out. Her movements were methodical, but her eyes softened whenever she glanced at the children. She knew what it felt like to watch them shiver and starve. She would not let that happen again. The middle child carried water for the goats, his breath curling in the frosty air. He checked their bedding carefully, tucking straw around their thin bodies. The small animals bleated softly, their warmth and milk a fragile but vital part of the family's survival. He patted them gently, whispering, "Stay strong. We need you." The youngest child swept the cottage floor each morning, humming as she worked, her little hands quick and eager. Her laughter often echoed against the wooden walls, cutting through the heaviness of shorter days. Even in such times, her innocence became a gift, reminding them all that life could still be sweet. By late November, The first frost hardened into something more enduring. The fields glistened white at dawn, the soil frozen stiff, the streams sheathed in brittle ice. The children pressed their hands against the frosted windows, marveling at the crystalline designs nature left behind, while Anna gently reminded them, beautiful, yes, but also dangerous. Frost is hunger's shadow. The father gathered his children outside one morning and crouched down, scooping a handful of frozen earth. This, he said, holding it up, is both our challenge and our teacher. It shows us that life bends, but does not break. We endure by learning, by preparing, by respecting the land. The children listened closely, the eldest repeating his father's words softly, as if committing them to memory. Inside, the hearth became the true center of their lives. The fire burned almost constantly, its glow spilling across the walls and chasing away the creeping cold. Meals were simple but steady. Barley porridge, flavored with dried herbs, roasted root vegetables, and occasional milk from the goats. The aroma of cooking filled the home, wrapping them in comfort even as frost crept across the windows. In the evenings, the family sat close by the fire, their shadows flickering on the walls. The eldest boy read aloud from a small, tattered manuscript, his voice steady, while the middle child tended the embers, learning to coax flames back from dying coals. The youngest curled against Anna, her small hands tracing patterns in the air as she listened. The father spoke often during those evenings. Winter will always come, he reminded them. But it will never be as cruel as it was if we are ready. Preparation is not just labor, it is love. Every log we stack, every seed we save, every stitch your mother makes, is love turned into survival. His words, spoken softly against the crackle of the fire, sank deep into their hearts. Outside, the village moved in similar rhythm. Neighbors reinforced fences, repaired roofs, and shared tools freely. The bitter famine of 1315 had stripped away illusions, but it had also left behind something stronger: unity. Families no longer shut themselves away in fear. Instead, they helped one another, trading dried herbs, lending strong backs for repairs, and exchanging advice on storage. By early December, snow began to fall, not heavy yet, but enough to blanket the fields in white silence. The Bruin children stepped outside, their boots crunching in the snow, their laughter carrying across the crisp air. For a moment, the hardships of the past faded into joy. Anna stood in the doorway, smiling faintly, the fire's glow behind her and the snow's brilliance before her, knowing this was what survival truly meant, not just enduring, but finding light even in the darkest months. That night, as the family huddled together, the father placed a hand on each child's shoulder. We survived last year's cruelty. This winter, we will not only survive, we will live. And in the heart of their small cottage, surrounded by frost and silence, the Bruin family carried that promise like an ember, small, steady, and unyielding. By mid-December, the snow no longer came as gentle flurries, but as steady curtains that blanketed the land in silence. Fields once golden with barley now lay hidden beneath layers of white, their bounty preserved in baskets within the Bruin cottage. The world outside seemed hushed, subdued, as if holding its breath beneath winter's weight. The Bruin family rose each morning to a world transformed. The eldest boy stepped outside to clear snow from the cottage roof, his breath clouding in the sharp air, while the father split frozen logs with careful, deliberate swings. Each strike of the axe echoed like a drumbeat in the stillness. The middle child carried wood inside, his arms straining, but his resolve steady. Even the youngest helped, patting snow from boots and sweeping small drifts from the doorway with her tiny broom. Inside, Anna kept the hearth alive as if it were another member of the family. She stirred porridge, thickened with herbs, set loaves of barley bread by the fire to warm, and brewed teas from dried mint and nettle. The aroma filled the cottage, mingling with the smoky air, wrapping the children in comfort even as the cold pressed harder against the walls. Each meal was humble, but every bite reminded them of how far they had come since the famine's cruelest days. Evenings grew longer, stretching into hours where darkness seemed endless. The fire's glow painted the walls in amber, flickering against bundles of dried herbs and baskets stacked neatly along the edges of the room. The eldest boy often read aloud, his voice rising above the howl of wind outside. The middle child listened with keen attention, tracing patterns in the firelight, while the youngest nestled against her mother's lap, lulled by the warmth of the hearth. The father spoke during these evenings with the tone of a man who had seen hunger's sharpest teeth. "The cold is no enemy if we respect it," he told them. "It reminds us to prepare, to endure, and to hold close what matters." He looked at each child in turn. "This fire is our shield. But so are we when we work, when we share, when we stay together." His words held weight, spoken not as comfort but as truth, carved from hardship. The village, too, had learned. Neighbors no longer braved the market often, but they called to one another across snowy paths, leaving small gifts at doorsteps. A bundle of firewood, a handful of dried beans, or a strip of cloth to patch a worn cloak. No act was too small. The famine had taught them that survival was not a solitary effort, but a shared endeavor. One night, the snow fell so heavily that the cottage door barely opened the next morning. The eldest boy dug a narrow path to the stream, his hands raw from the cold, while the father steadied him, teaching him to carve channels so the snow would not collapse again. The middle child carried buckets of water back, slipping once, but catching himself before the icy weight could drench him. Their laughter at the stumble broke the tension, a spark of joy amid the strain. Inside, Anna turned the day's labor into comfort. She warmed stones by the fire, wrapping them in cloth to place at the children's feet as they ate. She taught them to drink slowly, savoring warmth from within, and to stretch small portions of food into rituals that brought calm. "We do not eat only to live," she said softly. "We eat to remind ourselves that life has sweetness even in winter." By late December, Christmas approached. Though the village had little to spare, the church bells rang, and families gathered briefly to share prayers and songs. The Bruns attended, their cloaks pulled tight, their faces pale but lifted by the sound of voices rising together in the frozen air. The priest's words carried hope, that light always returns, that no winter is eternal. The children clung to those words, repeating them to each other as they trudged home through the snow. That night, Anna baked a small loaf sweetened with the last bit of honey saved from summer. The family gathered close, breaking the bread into equal pieces. They ate slowly, savoring the rare sweetness, their eyes reflecting the fire's glow. The youngest smiled, crumbs on her lips, whispering, "This tastes like spring." The father placed an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "It is spring, hidden in winter," he said. "Every ember, every seed, every act of care is spring waiting to return." And as the snow fell outside, blanketing the world in silence, the Brune family held fast to that truth. Their cottage stood small against the winter, but inside it, love, patience, and hard-earned wisdom burned brighter than the fire itself. The new year dawned, not with celebration, but with silence. January 1316 arrived, wrapped in frost, the fields stiff with ice, the air sharp as broken glass. Yet inside the Brune cottage, there was a flicker of renewal. The family had endured the worst months before, and with each passing sunrise, they felt the faint shift of time carrying them forward. The eldest boy marked the turn of the year by scratching a small cross into a wooden beam above the hearth. It was his way of keeping record, a sign that they had survived another cycle. The father watched him and nodded. "Every mark is proof," he said. "We are still here." Anna, the mother, prepared a stew of barley and dried herbs to honor the day. It was not a feast, not even close, but it was more than nothing, and in these times, that alone was worth quiet gratitude. She ladled the steaming broth into wooden bowls, urging the children to eat slowly, to feel warmth spread from within. The youngest clapped her hands at the rising steam, whispering, "It looks like clouds in the bowl." Outside, the village moved carefully. Neighbors greeted one another with small nods and murmured blessings for the new year. The priest passed along the frozen path, sprinkling holy water at each doorstep, his breath clouding in the frigid air. His prayers spoke of renewal, of endurance, of God's mercy in testing times. Though supplies remained meager, his words carried a weight heavier than food. They reminded people that they were not forgotten. The father spent much of January inspecting their remaining stores. He lifted each basket, ran calloused fingers through barley grains, and checked the herbs strung above the hearth. The eldest boy shadowed him, learning not just what to look for but how to feel the rhythm of survival, measuring what remained, rationing carefully, and deciding when to take risks. "This," his father said, "is as important as planting. To keep what we have safe is to plant seeds for tomorrow." The middle child carried wood and tended the goats, their coats now shaggy with winter growth. Though milk was thin, every drop mattered. He learned patience, stroking their necks to calm them before each milking. The youngest fed them scraps of hay, her laughter carrying warmth through the cold. Even small chores became rituals, anchoring the family in routine when the world outside seemed stripped bare. One evening, as the snow piled deep against the cottage walls, the family gathered close by the fire. The wind howled like wolves across the fields, rattling the shutters. Yet inside, Anna spoke softly, telling the children stories of summers past, of golden fields, of markets bustling with bread and cheese, of festivals where music rang across the square. The youngest leaned forward, eyes wide, asking, "Will it be like that again?" Her mother smiled, though her eyes glistened in the firelight. "Yes," she whispered. "The earth always remembers how to give. We only need to endure until she's ready." By late January, food grew scarcer and meals smaller, yet the family found new ways to make do. The father taught his children to grind acorns into coarse flour, mixing it with what little barley remained. The bread was dense and bitter, but it filled their stomachs. Anna brewed teas from dried bark and nettles, pressing warm cups into small hands. "Every drop is strength," she reminded them. The eldest boy, restless with hunger, began carving small wooden figures by the fire. He shaped them into goats, birds, and even stalks of barley, placing them on the hearth as tokens of hope. The youngest played with them, her laughter soft but steady, and for a moment, the family could almost forget the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. In the village, January weighed heavily on everyone. Bells tolled often, marking those who had not survived. Yet, even amid grief, neighbors left small gifts at one another's doors. A candle stub, a strip of cloth, a spoonful of honey. These small kindnesses carried as much strength as any meal. The Brune family, though weary, clung to that spirit. One night, when the storm outside roared so loudly it seemed the world might split apart, the father gathered his children close and said, "Do you hear the wind? It sounds fierce, but tomorrow it will pass. Nothing lasts forever, not storms, not hunger, not even winters as harsh as this." And so January stretched on, cold, hungry, and unyielding, yet met with patience, with stories, with laughter, with every small act of endurance that kept life flickering inside the Brune cottage. February arrived with a silence so heavy, it seemed the world itself had stopped breathing. Snow lay deep across the fields, smoothing the land into a white desert. The trees stood stiff and black, their branches glittering with ice. Even the streams, once the only sound in the village, were frozen under thick sheets of glassy frost. Inside the Brune cottage, the fire became their heartbeat. It burned low and steady, every ember carefully tended, every stick of wood weighed before use. The father rationed the pile with a soldier's precision, reminding his children that each flame tonight was one less for tomorrow. "We burn wisely," he said, "not because we have much, but because we must last." Meals shrank further as the days grew colder. Anna, resourceful as ever, boiled thin broth from bark shavings and a scattering of dried nettles. She stirred slowly, coaxing every trace of flavor from the pot. The children ate in silence, chewing carefully, savoring each swallow as though it were a feast. Hunger carved their faces lean, but discipline gave them strength. The eldest boy had grown quieter, his frame taller but thinner, his eyes carrying a weight far older than his years. He spent long hours outside with his father, checking traps for rabbits or birds. More often than not, they returned empty-handed, yet he did not complain. Each failure was folded into patience, each empty snare a reminder that survival was earned one step at a time. The middle child became the guardian of the goats. He brushed their shaggy coats with numb fingers, whispered to them as though his words alone could keep them alive. Milk was scarce, only a few drops each day, but he carried them proudly to his mother, treating each cup as treasure. The youngest, still full of innocence, helped by carrying hay and humming softly as she worked. Her small voice filled the cottage with a warmth the fire could not provide. In the village, despair deepened. The church bells tolled more often, their mournful sound drifting across the frost. Candles burned late in cottages where illness had taken root. Neighbors passed each other with hollow eyes, offering no more than nods of acknowledgement. Yet, even in this bleak season, there were sparks of kindness. One afternoon, The Bruns opened their door to find a small bundle left on the step. A few onions, shriveled but edible, wrapped in a scrap of cloth. No note, no name, just quiet solidarity in the face of suffering. One night, the storm struck without warning. Winds screamed through the valley, rattling shutters and tearing branches from trees. Snow whirled thick against the cottage, sealing the family inside. The fire strained against the draft, smoke curling low across the rafters. The children huddled under blankets, their breaths visible in the frigid air. The father stood guard by the door, axe in hand, listening for the howl of wolves. They had grown bold in these lean times, and more than one villager had spoken of glowing eyes in the forest's edge. The eldest boy kept his knife close, his jaw tight, though his hands trembled with cold. Yet even in this night of fear, the family found a moment of grace. Anna began to hum softly, her voice weaving through the storm's roar. The children joined, their thin voices rising together, fragile but steady. For a while, the wind seemed less fierce, the cold less biting. They sang not because it would fill their bellies, but because it reminded them they were alive, together, and unbroken. When the storm finally passed, the cottage stood buried to its windows in snow. The father and eldest boy dug a path through the drifts, their breath steaming in the bitter air. The world outside was dazzling and cruel. Fields buried, fences broken, trees snapped under the weight of ice. Yet the sun shone sharp against the snow, and for the first time in weeks, the light seemed stronger, as if hinting that winter's grip, though merciless, was not eternal. That evening, as the family sat close by the fire, the father spoke with quiet determination. "We have survived storms before," he said. "We will survive this one. Remember, winter is not endless. Every day we endure brings us closer to spring." The children leaned against him, drawing strength from his words. Anna ladled the last of the broth into their bowls, her hands steady though her body was weary. The youngest whispered, "Spring will come." And for the first time in weeks, the cottage filled with something stronger than hunger, hope. Late February bled into March, and though the snow still lay thick upon the land, small changes began to whisper through the silence. Icicles dripped faintly under the midday sun, and patches of dark soil appeared like bruises beneath the white. To the Bruns, each drop of water was a promise. The thaw had not yet come, but it was stirring. Inside the cottage, the fire burned low, its wood rationed to the slimmest measure. The father placed logs with the care of a jeweler setting gems. Each ember mattered. Smoke clung to the rafters, but warmth, however fragile, still lingered. The children pressed close, wrapped in wool blankets that smelled of smoke and earth. Food had grown scarcer still. Anna stretched the last handfuls of barley with crushed acorns, bitter roots, and whatever herbs she could gather from the edges of the frozen wood. The bread was dark and heavy, its crust hard as stone. Yet the children ate without complaint, chewing slowly, eyes lowered, understanding that even crumbs meant survival. One morning, the eldest boy rose before dawn and followed his father into the forest. The ground crunched underfoot, brittle with frost. They checked their snares, empty again, then searched for tracks in the snow. At last, they found faint prints a hare, thin and desperate. Hours of patience brought reward. The boy's arrow flew true, and the animal fell. It was not much, But when they returned home carrying the rabbit, the youngest child clapped her hands, her eyes shining with joy. That night, Anna made stew so thin it barely coated the spoon, but the flavor of meat filled the cottage with hope. The middle child had become quiet and thoughtful. He tended the goats with steady hands, though their ribs showed through their coats. He whispered to them as he brushed their fur, promising they would see spring together. Milk was scarce, just a few drops mixed with water, but he carried it to his mother with pride. "It is enough," he told her, though he knew it was not. The youngest child, though small, carried the spirit of the family. She would hum while gathering sticks, her voice bright against the gray silence. One evening, as frost glazed the windows and the wind rattled the shutters, she pointed to the sky. Through a crack in the clouds, a single star gleamed sharp and clear. "It's watching us," she whispered. The father pulled her close, his rough hand resting on her hair. "Yes," he said, "and as long as we see it, we know we are not forgotten." In the village, the signs of suffering were everywhere. The marketplace, once filled with shouts and laughter, was quiet. A loaf of bread cost a week's wages. Families bartered with scraps. A strip of cloth for a handful of onions, a wooden tool for a few turnips. Priests spoke of God's wrath, urging repentance. But in hushed corners, people whispered of curses, of poisoned rains, of omens in the skies. Yet even in despair, kindness surfaced. A neighbor slipped a bundle of dried nettles to Anna in the square. Another shared a strip of salted fish with the children. These small gifts, carried in silence, stitched the community together in ways stronger than any sermon. By early March, storms struck again. Snow swept across the fields, piling against cottages, choking paths. Wolves prowled nearer to the village, their cries echoing in the night. The father and eldest boy stood guard with axe and knife. Shadows stretched long by the firelight. Fear pressed against the walls, but the family held close, their strength rooted in togetherness. When the storm cleared, the world lay buried in silence once more. Yet here and there, water trickled from the melting snow. Streams that had lain still for months now murmured faintly under the ice. The sound was small, almost lost in the vast emptiness, but to the Bruns it was like music. It meant change was near. That evening, Anna placed the last of the acorn bread on the table. She broke it carefully into equal pieces, her hands trembling not from hunger, but from weariness. The father looked at his children, faces thin, eyes shadowed, yet still bright with life, and spoke softly, "We endure. We have come this far. The earth will give again, and when it does, we will be ready." The children leaned against him, their heads heavy with fatigue, but their hearts steadied by his words. Outside, the frost still ruled the land, but within the walls of the cottage, a fragile flame of hope burned on, as steady as the fire in the hearth. Early March slipped quietly into April, and though the nights still bit with cold, the days began to soften. The snow retreated in patches, leaving behind dark, heavy soil glistening with meltwater. To the Brun family, these bare spots were more beautiful than gold. They meant life was stirring beneath the earth. The father was the first to notice green shoots, pushing timidly through the thawed soil. Barley that had clung stubbornly to life now trembled in the breeze, fragile but defiant. He knelt, brushing away clumps of ice, his calloused hands gentle as he whispered, "Thanks to God, to the land, to whatever power had carried them this far. Inside the cottage, the air smelled different, less of smoke and damp, more of wet earth and faint greenery carried in by the wind. Anna opened the shutters a little wider, letting in pale sunlight that spilled across the wooden table. The children blinked against the brightness, their cheeks hollow but now kissed with color. Meals remained meager, but they had changed. Nettles, dandelion shoots, and wild greens gathered from the forest edges were added to thin broths, their sharp flavors a shock after months of bland survival bread. The youngest wrinkled her nose at the bitterness, but her mother smiled. "This is the taste of spring," she said, and the little girl ate with pride. The eldest boy worked beside his father, learning how to loosen the thawed soil without tearing tender roots. Together, they cleared a patch near the cottage, marking rows for barley and peas. Each seed was pressed into the damp earth like a prayer. The boy, who had once only fetched wood and carried water, now stood taller, his hands dark with soil, his gaze steady with responsibility. The middle child, smaller and more thoughtful, busied himself with storing early finds. He gathered mushrooms and herbs, drying them carefully by the hearth. His mother praised his patience, saying, "These small bundles may save us when the rains come again." The boy beamed, his pride quiet but deep. Even the youngest contributed. She carried small stones to mark garden rows, her tiny hands smudged with mud, her laughter lightening the long hours of labor. At night, she would hum softly, curling against her mother, the sound of her song like the first birds returning to the fields. In the village, neighbors too were stirring from the long slumber of frost. Families emerged from shuttered cottages, their steps cautious but purposeful. The market reopened, though its stalls held only wild greens, herbs, and scraps. Yet the sound of voices bargaining, greeting, sharing, returned, and with it the rhythm of community. One afternoon the father walked with his eldest to trade a bundle of wool for a handful of onions. On the way, they passed the church. The bells rang not in mourning this time, but in thanksgiving for the first signs of spring. The boy listened to their echo over the thawing fields and felt, for the first time in many months, that the world was breathing again. That evening, Anna baked a stew unlike any they had tasted since autumn. It held greens, roots, and even a few slivers of dried meat saved through the winter. The children ate slowly, savoring each spoonful as though it were a feast. The father lifted his bowl, steam rising in the fading light. "This," he said quietly, "is what survival tastes like." When darkness fell, the family sat together near the hearth. The fire burned steady, but it was no longer their only lifeline. Outside, the wind carried not just cold, but the scent of thawing earth and new growth. The youngest pressed her forehead to the window, pointing at the faint shimmer of stars above. "They're brighter now," she whispered. The father wrapped an arm around her, his voice steady. "They shine because spring is here, and so are we." And for the first time in many long months, the Brune family went to sleep not fearing the night, but dreaming of tomorrow when the land, once cruel and unyielding, would offer its gifts again. By mid-April, the frost had finally loosened its grip. The soil, once frozen solid, now broke apart beneath the father's hoe, rich and dark with promise. For the Brune family, this was more than dirt, it was the future. Every handful of soil carried the memory of hunger, and every seed was an act of defiance against the winter that had nearly claimed them. The father rose before dawn, his breath no longer steaming as fiercely in the cool air. With the eldest boy at his side, he measured out small rows behind the cottage. The boy pressed seeds into the damp earth with care, whispering as though each kernel could hear his hopes. "Grow strong," he muttered. His father smiled faintly, remembering his own father's words, spoken in the same fields decades before. The middle child, ever thoughtful, carried baskets of compost and ashes saved from the hearth, spreading them to enrich the soil. "Every scrap matters," his mother reminded him. He nodded solemnly, understanding that survival was not only about endurance, it was about preparation, about honoring even the smallest resources. Anna worked steadily inside and outside the cottage. In the mornings, she guided the youngest, teaching her how to recognize early herbs sprouting near the hedges. This one soothes a cough. This one eases the stomach. The little girl repeated each name, her small hands clutching leaves like treasures. In the afternoons, Anna turned to preservation, drying herbs on clean cloths, boiling greens lightly before setting them aside for later. Meals grew brighter with each passing week. Instead of the heavy, bitter loaves of acorn bread, the family now tasted nettle soups, fresh onion greens, and even the first shoots of wild garlic. The sharp flavor brought tears to their eyes, but also laughter. "It burns," the youngest exclaimed, giggling as her brothers teased her. Anna only smiled, reminding them, this burn means health returning. In the village, change stirred as well. Neighbors exchanged seedlings, shared advice, and worked together repairing fences and tools. The blacksmith's hammer rang again, though weakly, a sound that had been absent through the long winter. The market, once bleak, now smelled of damp earth and fresh herbs. Families greeted each other with cautious smiles, carrying baskets with more than just scraps. One afternoon, the father returned with a small bag of peas traded for wool. He poured the round seeds into the children's hands. They stared at them as though they were jewels. "These," he said, "will feed us come summer. Guard them like gold." And so together they planted each pea carefully, the children's laughter mingling with bird song above. The evenings became gentler. The hearth still burned, but it was no longer their only defense. The children sat near the fire, not for survival, but for stories. The eldest carved wooden spades and little animals. The middle child practiced braiding straw. The youngest played with a doll stuffed with wool scraps, humming to herself. Anna sewed quietly, while the father leaned back, listening to the creak of the roof and the soft wind carrying the scent of new growth. Outside, the fields shifted from gray to green. The first blossoms appeared in the hedgerows, fragile but certain. Bees buzzed, tentative at first, then bolder as the days warmed. The goats grazed with more vigor, their milk richer. Even the birds returned, filling the air with songs that had been absent for months. One evening, after a long day of planting, the father gathered his family outside. The sky was painted in shades of orange and violet, and the fields glimmered with dew. He placed a hand on each child's shoulder. "Remember this day," he said softly. "We plant not just for food, but for hope. These seeds will carry us forward, just as we carried each other through the dark." The children nodded, their eyes reflecting both the fading sunlight and the lessons etched by hardship. That night, the family lay down to sleep, not haunted by hunger, but dreaming of fields heavy with grain, gardens full of vegetables, and a year shaped by their own resilience. By late April, tiny shoots pushed bravely through the damp earth. Barley sprouted in thin green lines, peas stretched delicate tendrils toward their supports, and wild herbs unfurled leaves along the hedges. For the Brune family, every sprout was a miracle, a living promise that their hunger would not return with the same cruelty as before. The eldest boy took pride in checking the garden each morning. He crouched low, brushing soil from tender leaves, marveling at how something so fragile could hold so much strength. "They're small," he said to his father, "but they fight." His father nodded, his face lined with both fatigue and quiet pride. "Just like us." The middle child, more thoughtful, began keeping a tally. Each day he scratched marks into a piece of wood, counting new sprouts, measuring their growth. Numbers steadied him, reminding him that progress could be slow, but always moving forward. Anna encouraged him, saying, "Every mark you make is a story of survival." Even the youngest child played her part. She carried water in a small wooden cup, dribbling it carefully over the plants, her laughter echoing as droplets sparkled in the sunday. "The plants will grow taller than me," she declared, twirling in the field. Her joy was contagious, a reminder that even after hardship, innocence and wonder could bloom again. Inside the cottage, meals began to carry new scents. Anna boiled fresh nettles into soups, stirred in garlic greens, and added handfuls of wild herbs to porridge. The flavors were sharp, fresh, and unlike anything they had tasted through the long gray winter. At night, she baked small loaves of bread using the last of the stored flour, mixing in chopped herbs to stretch it further. Each meal felt like both nourishment and celebration. The father also taught the eldest boy how to rotate the planting rows. "Never take too much from the same soil," he explained. "The earth gives if we treat it with care." These lessons were as vital as the food itself, shaping not only their survival, but their future. In the village, signs of renewal grew louder each day. Neighbors met at the edge of fields, sharing advice, trading seeds, and celebrating the first signs of growth. Children raced along muddy paths, chasing each other between rows of sprouting vegetables. The market, once silent, now carried the hum of barter and laughter. Small baskets of greens and early herbs appeared on tables, a quiet sign that the season of hunger was loosening its hold. Evenings were gentler. The fire still burned, but less fiercely. Its glow mingled with the scent of fresh soil drifting in through open windows. The family gathered around the hearth, not to stave off deathly cold, but to reflect on what the earth had given back. The eldest boy spoke of the tallest barley shoots. The middle child described how the herbs had doubled in size, and the youngest laughed as she recalled her water cup spilling over her toes. One night, as the children drifted to sleep, Anna whispered to her husband, "Do you hear them? Their laughter sounds different now, lighter." He nodded, listening to the steady rhythm of breathing and the soft creak of the cottage walls. The land heals, and so do we. By early May, blossoms dotted the hedgerows. Bees hummed steadily, goats grazed contentedly, and streams ran clearer than they had in months. The family felt it in their bones. The season of desperation had given way to the season of possibility. The father looked out over the fields, hands resting on the wooden fence, and smiled. The barley rows glimmered faintly in the fading light. Not yet a harvest, but undeniably alive. "We have planted hope," he murmured. And for the first time since the terrible famine had begun, he believed fully that hope would answer. By early June, the fields around the Brunn family's cottage had transformed. What once were fragile shoots now stood strong, barley stalks stretching tall, peas curling upward, and vegetables thickening with promise. The meadow shimmered with wildflowers, and the air buzzed with bees and songbirds. Life pulsed everywhere, vibrant and insistent. The father rose before dawn each day, walking the rows slowly, his hand brushing across leaves still wet with dew. "See this," he told his eldest boy, pointing to a barley stalk bent too low. "Strong plants can break if they're not supported." Together they tied the stalks gently with twine, careful not to strangle the growth. These lessons were not just about farming, they were about patience, foresight, and respect. The middle child, thoughtful as ever, began to notice patterns. He saw how water pooled in low spots after rain, how certain plants leaned toward the sun, and how pests nibbled at tender leaves when no one was watching. He recorded these things in marks on wood, slowly learning the language of the land. "It's like the earth is speaking," he whispered to his mother, who nodded knowingly. The youngest child brought her own kind of wisdom. She danced between rows, laughing as butterflies darted past, her tiny hands reaching for blossoms. Though she could not yet labor like her siblings, her joy reminded the family why they endured. Every giggle was a reminder that life, even after famine, was worth fighting for. Inside the cottage, Anna's meals grew richer. Fresh peas sweetened stews, barley porridge thickened with herbs, and leafy greens filled bowls once empty through the long gray winter. She even made small cakes flavored with wild mint, a treat that sent the children into fits of delight. "It tastes like summer," the youngest shouted, crumbs dotting her cheeks. But with abundance came new worries. Dark clouds gathered more often in June, bringing sudden storms that bent stalks and threatened fragile crops. The father taught the eldest boy how to dig shallow trenches to guide water safely away, and the middle child built small mounds of earth to protect roots from being washed out. Each task was urgent, a race against nature's whims. The village, too, moved with restless energy. Neighbors exchanged tools, warned one another of pests, and gathered in the evenings to share stories of the day's trials. In the marketplace, stalls overflowed with early vegetables, herbs, and even small bundles of dried meat. The chatter of barter was mixed with laughter, a sound that had been absent for far too long. One evening, after a particularly heavy rain, the family gathered near the hearth, their clothes damp but spirits unbroken. The father laid a hand on the table. "Storms will come," he said, his voice steady. "But so will clear skies. We cannot control the heavens, but we can care for what is ours." The children nodded, absorbing not just the words, but the calm resolve behind them. That night, lightning flashed across the horizon, and the wind rattled the shutters. Yet inside, the Brunn family sat close, their laughter rising above the storm. They had learned that resilience was not the absence of fear, it was the choice to face it together. By late June, the land seemed to sigh with relief. The storms eased, the crops straightened, and the meadow glowed beneath long hours of summer Sunday. The family felt the rhythm of life settle into balance. Work was still hard, but it no longer carried the desperation of survival. Now, every task felt like an investment in the future. The father looked across the field one evening, barley swaying golden in the wind, and said softly, "This land tried to break us last winter, but look at it now, it gives back." The children followed his gaze, and for the first time they saw not just survival, but abundance waiting ahead. By early July, the sun hung high and merciless in the sky. The soft rains of spring had faded, and in their place came dry heat that cracked the soil and tested every seed the family had planted. The once gentle breeze turned sharp and hot, sweeping dust across the fields. The father rose earlier than ever, working before the heat became unbearable. He and the eldest boy carried buckets from the stream, pouring water carefully into the trenches they had dug in spring. "Not too much at once," he reminded, "or the soil will harden." The boy nodded, sweat dripping from his brow, his small hands blistered but determined. The middle child battled another enemy, pests. Caterpillars chewed at the peas, and beetles clung to tender leaves. Armed with nothing more than patience and his own sharp eyes, he plucked them away one by one. "It feels endless," he muttered, but his mother reminded him, "Each leaf you save feeds us tomorrow." Slowly, he learned that even the smallest actions mattered. The youngest child, too small for heavy labor, carried tiny pails of water to the goats and scattered straw to keep them cool. She laughed when droplets splashed her face, her joy cutting through the heaviness of the day. To the family, her laughter was as vital as water to the crops. Inside the cottage, Anna adjusted meals to suit the season. She boiled herbs into cooling teas, baked flatbreads that could last several days, and roasted vegetables slowly to stretch their flavor. On the hottest afternoons, she kept the children inside, teaching them songs and old stories while they rested. "The land is patient," she said, "and so must we be." But the heat pressed on the village like a weight. Some families lost whole rows of vegetables, their plants withering in the relentless Sunday. Wells dried quicker than expected, forcing neighbors to share what little water they had. Arguments sparked at the marketplace over the price of barley and dried meat, but more often, voices lowered, and people leaned on one another. Cooperation, once born of desperation in the famine year, remained their strongest tool. One evening, after a long day of work, the father gathered his children by the field. The barley swayed in the fading light, golden and stubborn. "Do you see how it endures?" he asked. "It bows under sun and storm, but it doesn't break. That is what we must be." His words sank into them deeper than the roots of the crops they tended. By mid-July, the first small harvest of peas and herbs arrived. The eldest boy cut vines carefully, the middle child gathered herbs to dry, and the youngest carried baskets with pride. Inside, Anna turned their efforts into a feast. Pea stew, flatbread with herbs, and even a touch of honey saved from spring. The family ate slowly, savoring each bite, knowing how hard won it was. That night, as they sat by the hearth, the father spoke quietly. "Last year, hunger nearly broke us. This year, the land tests us differently. But remember, heat, storm, frost, these are all parts of life's circle. And as long as we work, as long as we care for each other, we will not just survive, we will endure." The fire burned low, casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, insects hummed in the night air. Inside, the Brune family leaned close, their weariness softened by pride. They were not the same people who had nearly starved in the famine. They were stronger now, seasoned by hardship, bound by love, and alive with the stubborn hope that no sun, storm, or frost could take away. By late July, the fields turned gold. The barley stalks, once tender and green, now swayed heavily under the weight of their ripened grain. The air itself carried the dry, sweet scent of harvest, a promise of bread after so many months of struggle. The father sharpened his sickle at dawn, its metal catching the first rays of light. "Today begins the true test," he told his sons. The eldest boy walked beside him into the fields, clutching a smaller blade, eager to prove himself. The middle child carried baskets for gathering, while the youngest ran ahead, laughing, her bare feet brushing against the tall stalks. Harvesting was slow, grueling work. The sun beat down, insects buzzed, and dust clung to sweat-soaked skin. Yet every cut of the sickle, every bundle tied and laid in the sun, felt like a victory. The father showed his eldest how to swing with steady rhythm, not speed, and how to lay stalks in neat rows to dry. "Grain rots quickly if we are careless," he warned. The boy listened, his arms aching, his pride carrying him forward. Anna worked inside the cottage, preparing meals to keep their strength. She boiled barley porridge flavored with mint, baked flatbreads for the field, and carried water mixed with herbs to cool their throats. When the children returned at midday, flushed and tired, she wiped sweat from their brows and whispered encouragement. Her presence was the quiet heartbeat that kept the household steady. The middle child grew fascinated with the herbs drying above the hearth. He sorted them by scent and use, learning which could soothe aching muscles, which could calm the stomach, and which preserved food. Under his mother's watch, he began to tie small bundles for trade at the village market. His hands, once clumsy, grew deft, and Anna smiled to see patience shaping him. The youngest contributed in her own way. She carried small stalks of barley in her arms, as proud as if she'd harvested them herself. When the family rested in the evening, she would scatter seeds for the chickens and hum softly to the goats. Her joy lifted tired spirits, reminding everyone that harvest was not just toil, but also celebration. The village, too, stirred with the season. Neighbors worked shoulder to shoulder, calling out greetings across fields, exchanging tools, and lending extra hands where needed. The church bells rang on Sundays, their sound echoing across the golden land, calling the weary to rest and prayer. After Mass, villagers often lingered, sharing bread, honey, and stories of the harvest. Unity, tested during famine, now blossomed into trust. As August arrived, storms rolled across the horizon, sudden bursts of rain that threatened the drying grain. The family rushed to cover bundles with straw, tying them down against the wind. The father taught his children to act quickly but calmly. "Panic ruins what patience builds," he reminded them. Even as thunder rumbled, their movements were steady, driven by hard-earned wisdom. When the storms passed, the fields glistened with fresh life. The puddles sparkled in the sun, and the barley, though shaken, still stood. The eldest boy marveled aloud. "It's as if the land itself refuses to break." His father nodded, pride shining in tired eyes. "And so must we." By mid-August, the first sacks of barley filled the cottage. Anna baked barley bread with crisp crusts and soft, fragrant centers. The children tore into it eagerly, each bite a memory of hunger defeated. For the first time in many months, their stomachs felt full, their hearts lighter. In the evenings, the family sat by the hearth, hands rough from work, bodies aching but content. The father placed his calloused hand on the table. "This," he said, gesturing to the bread, the herbs, the children's laughter, "this is why we endure." Outside, crickets chirped in the fields, and the warm wind carried the scent of earth and grain. Inside, the Brune family savored the sweetness of survival, not just scraping by, but finally tasting the richness of life returned. By early September, the air began to change. The heat of summer softened into cooler breezes, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves and damp soil. The fields, once a blaze of gold, now grew quieter as the last of the barley was tied and stacked in careful bundles. The Brune family knew well, harvest was only half the battle, preservation was the other. The father spent long hours in the yard, spreading barley on wooden racks so air could circulate. He showed the eldest boy how to turn the grain with a wooden paddle, preventing mold. "Every seed we save today," he explained, "becomes bread tomorrow. Waste nothing." The boy's arms ached, but his eyes gleamed with pride as he absorbed his father's lessons. The middle child worked beside Anna inside the cottage. Together they sorted vegetables and herbs, laying some to dry above the hearth and storing roots in clay pots packed with straw. He learned how carrots and turnips kept longer in cool corners, and how salt could preserve meat when available. For him, every jar sealed, every herb tied, was not just food, it was security. The youngest, still too small for heavy tasks, found joy in carrying little bundles of herbs or filling baskets with straw. She sang softly as she worked, her voice light against the crackle of the hearth fire. Her laughter, like sunlight through clouds, reminded them that survival wasn't only about grit, it was also about keeping spirits alive. Outside, the village moved with the same urgency. Neighbors traded advice on storing grain, exchanged surplus vegetables, and mended fences before storms could arrive. The blacksmith sharpened tools for long nights ahead, while women gathered at the well, sharing news and small comforts. Where hunger had once divided, cooperation now bound them tightly. One chilly evening, as the family sat near the fire, Anna baked barley loaves seasoned with dried rosemary. The scent filled the cottage, mingling with the smoky warmth of the hearth. The children ate slowly, savoring every bite, aware of how precious it was. The father lifted his bowl, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "This bread," he said softly, "is more than food. It is proof that we have endured." But autumn was not without its tests. Storms swept across the land, bending stalks and flooding low fields. One morning, the family awoke to find part of their barley stacks damp. Without hesitation, the father and eldest boy spread them in the sun, turning the grain hour after hour until the moisture lifted. "Carelessness," the father warned, "can undo a season's work." The lesson struck deep, etched into tired arms and determined hearts. By mid-October, frost began to nip at the edges of the meadow. The children woke to see silvery patterns on the window panes. The youngest pressed her hands against the glass, marveling at the fragile beauty. But Anna knew what it meant. She doubled their efforts, drying herbs faster, sealing grain tighter, and preparing stews hearty enough to withstand the growing chill. The family's routine became a rhythm of gathering, preserving, and reflecting. The eldest carved wooden pegs to secure thatch against wind. The middle child helped line walls with mud and straw to block drafts. The youngest stacked firewood, humming as she worked, her tiny arms determined. Every task, no matter how small, fed the larger goal: readiness. Evenings grew quieter. Outside, the wind carried the scent of burning leaves and the sound of neighbors calling across darkening fields. Inside, the Brune family huddled by the fire, listening to the crackle and trading soft stories. The father reminded them that survival was never chance, it was preparation, care, and unity. As autumn deepened, their cottage transformed into a fortress of warmth and sustenance. Baskets of grain lined the walls, herbs dangled overhead, and dried vegetables filled clay jars. It was not abundance, but it was enough. And for a family who had once faced empty cupboards and bitter cold, enough felt like victory. By early November, the signs of winter crept closer each day. Dawn came later, dusk arrived sooner, and the air carried a sharp bite that hinted at harsher nights ahead. Frost glazed the meadow in the mornings, sparkling under pale sunlight before melting back into the soil. For the Brune family, each shimmer of white was both beautiful and ominous, a reminder that time to prepare was running short. The father inspected the roof carefully, tugging at thatch, pressing mud into cracks, and tightening ropes. He showed his eldest son how to overlap the layers of straw so rain would run off instead of seeping in. A strong roof, he told him, is worth more than 100 loaves of bread in the storm. The boy listened closely, his small hands imitating his father's practiced motions. Anna, inside the cottage, turned her attention to storage. She organized baskets of barley, checked clay jars for cracks, and tied dried herbs into neat bundles above the hearth. The middle child carried roots into the coolest corner, stacking them carefully so air could flow between. She explained to him how dampness could spoil food, and how vigilance was as important as labor. He nodded, realizing that survival meant more than work, it meant watchfulness. The youngest, eager to help, carried handfuls of straw to line the goats' bedding. Her small hands shook with the chill, but she beamed proudly each time she returned with another bundle. The animals, though thin, offered milk richer now than in the worst of last winter, and Anna treasured every drop. She warmed cups for the children in the mornings, whispering, "This is the taste of strength." Outside, the village moved with the same urgency. Men hauled wood into great stacks, women salted meat and sealed jars, and children gathered fallen twigs for kindling. The blacksmith hammered late into the evening, repairing tools before the deep freeze. The sound of iron striking iron echoed like a heartbeat through the crisp night air. One evening, as the wind howled outside, the Brune family sat close to the hearth. Anna ladled a barley stew, thickened with turnips and flavored with rosemary. The scent filled the cottage, rich and earthy, a promise of comfort against the cold pressing at the shutters. The eldest boy chewed slowly, then asked, "Will it be as hard as last winter?" The father looked at the flames before answering. "We cannot know," he said softly. "But we are wiser now. We prepare. We work together. And that will carry us through." His hand rested on his son's shoulder, steady and reassuring. By mid-November, the days had grown even shorter. Shadows lengthened quickly, and families lit hearths before supper, their smoke rising in thin gray trails across the valley. The Brune children noticed how quiet the village had become, less laughter in the lanes, fewer games in the fields. Life moved inward, closer to fire and food, closer to family. Still, there were moments of joy. On a frosty morning, the middle child found a cluster of late-growing mushrooms beneath a fallen log. He carried them triumphantly home, and Anna roasted them lightly, filling the cottage with a nutty aroma. The youngest clapped her hands, delighted by the treat. Such small discoveries reminded them that even in bleak times, nature still offered gifts to those who searched carefully. As November deepened, storms swept across the land, rain lashed the windows, and the wind rattled shutters like a warning drum. The father stayed awake many nights, listening to the roof groan, ready to leap up if a leak appeared. But the repairs held, and each morning, when the family found themselves still dry and safe, gratitude filled the air as surely as the smell of smoke and stew. Evenings were their sanctuary. They gathered near the fire, Anna spinning wool into thread, the eldest carving small wooden figures, the middle child bundling herbs, and the youngest humming softly as she stacked straw. The firelight painted their faces in warm hues, and the father's voice carried steady lessons. Hardship will test us, but it cannot break us if we hold fast. By the month's end, the first real snow arrived. Flakes drifted silently from a heavy sky, blanketing fields and rooftops in white. The children pressed against the window, wide-eyed at the transformation. The youngest whispered, "It looks like the world is sleeping." The father nodded. "Yes," he said, "but we must stay awake. Winter sleeps for no one." Inside, the Brune family felt ready. Their shelves were lined, their walls secure, and their hearts bound by the memory of what they had already survived. The coldest year had taught them hard lessons. Now, as another winter loomed, they carried those lessons like armor, prepared, vigilant, and together. By early December, the world outside the Brune cottage had transformed into a hushed white expanse. Snow drifted down in steady flurries, blanketing fields, cottages, and fences in silence. The barley fields that once swayed golden now lay buried under frost, their memory hidden beneath a frozen sheet. Each morning, the children pressed their small hands to the window, marveling at the delicate crystals that clung to the glass, sparkling like tiny stars. Inside, life slowed to the rhythm of the hearth. The fire became the family's heart, glowing steady and bright, its warmth reaching into every corner of their modest home. Anna worked near it constantly, drying herbs, stirring pots, and teaching the youngest child to wind wool into neat balls. "Patience," she whispered, "is as important as strength." Her words carried the quiet wisdom of a woman who knew survival was more than enduring. It was shaping life, even in hardship. The father and eldest boy checked the stored food daily. They sorted through baskets of barley, sniffed for dampness, and turned roots so none would rot unseen. Every preserved stalk of grain was precious, every vegetable a treasure. The boy learned to inspect with careful eyes, his father guiding his hand across the rough surface of burlap sacks. "See here," he explained, "a soft spot means spoilage. Better to find it now than lose more later." The middle child carried water to the goats and spread fresh straw in their shelter. He worked silently, his breath forming pale clouds in the frigid air. The goats, though thin, nuzzled his hands gratefully, their quiet bleats a reminder of the fragile but enduring life they provided. The youngest toddled behind, carrying small handfuls of straw, her laughter a bright spark in the muted landscape. Meals were hearty, but simple. Anna boiled barley into thick porridge, adding dried herbs for flavor. Occasionally, she roasted a handful of vegetables over the fire, the smell filling the cottage with warmth that reached beyond hunger. The children ate slowly, savoring each bite, as though every spoonful was proof they had outlasted yet another day of winter's grip. The village, too, had quieted under snow. Neighbors no longer lingered outdoors, but moved briskly between cottages, smoke trailing from chimneys in thin gray lines. Yet community bonds persisted. Families exchanged small favors, an extra candle, a pinch of salt, a shared log for the fire. These gestures, though modest, carried profound weight, proof that survival was as much about compassion as it was about labor. One evening, as the snow piled high against their door, the family gathered closer than ever to the hearth. The eldest boy read softly from a worn manuscript parables of patience and resilience, his young voice steady in the firelight. The middle child tended the embers, ensuring no flame died, while the youngest curled into Anna's lap, her small hands tracing the carved wooden figures her brother had whittled in warmer months. The father looked at them all, his voice calm. "Winter will test us again, but we are not the same as last year. We are wiser, stronger, prepared." Nights were long, yet not empty. The family filled them with quiet rituals, songs hummed softly, stories told of summers past, and the steady rhythm of spinning wool and mending garments. Even as wind howled against the shutters, the hearth glowed, defying the dark. By mid-December, frost lay heavy on rooftops each morning, and the days seemed to vanish quickly into twilight. But the Brune family carried no panic in their hearts. The lessons of the coldest year, the hunger, the fear, the endless frost, had forged them into something new. They had learned to respect the land, to trust their labor, and above all, to lean on one another. And so, as the snow thickened and nights stretched long, they endured. Together, wrapped in warmth, bound by care, and carried by the steady promise that even the harshest season could not erase the quiet miracle of survival. As December deepened and the year reached its close, the Brun family settled into the slow rhythm of winter nights. Snow blanketed the village in silence, muffling every sound except the crackle of fires and the faint creak of wooden beams under frost. Yet within their cottage there was no despair. Only warmth, only the quiet strength of people who had endured the coldest year and found a way to carry on. The father often paused by the window, watching the white world outside, his breath fogging the glass. He no longer saw only hardship in the snow, but also a reminder of how far they had come. Anna hummed softly as she spun wool, her voice low and comforting, weaving patience into each note. The eldest boy read by firelight, the middle child traced patterns in the frost on the walls, and the youngest, eyes heavy with sleep, curled close to her mother's lap. Every small act had become sacred. Sharing a cup of porridge, laying another log on the fire, pulling a blanket tighter around a sibling, these were victories as meaningful as the harvest itself. The family understood now that survival was not only about food or fire, but about the warmth of love, the steady bond that outlasted the harshest season. The village, too, pulsed quietly with resilience. Neighbors exchanged greetings as they carried firewood, offered a kind word, or lent a hand. In the silence of snow, community spoke louder than any song. Life had not been broken by the winter of 1315. It had been reshaped, strengthened, bound together in ways that only hardship could teach. On the final night before the turn of the year, the family gathered close around the hearth. The fire's glow painted their tired but peaceful faces, and shadows danced gently on the walls. The father looked at his children and said softly, "We have endured the coldest year, and because we endured, spring will return. It always does." The children leaned into him, their small hearts steady with trust. Outside, the world slept under snow. Inside, the Brune family carried a flame that no frost could extinguish. And that flame of patience, of care, of love, would guide them into the seasons to come. So, as this story closes, take a deep breath. Feel the warmth of the hearth, the softness of a woolen blanket, the steady rhythm of life pressing onward. Let it remind you that even in the hardest winters, light can be found in small acts of love. Thank you for staying with this journey through one of history's coldest years. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. And now, wherever you are, in the US, in Europe, or anywhere in the world, may your night be calm, your heart be light, and your sleep be deep. Good night, my friends. Sleep well.